The first grenade landed 15 feet short. Private Miller watched it tumble end over end down the mud, slicked slope, before detonating harmlessly against a coral outcrop. The machine gun opened up immediately. The muzzle flash came from somewhere inside the tree roots, maybe 40 yards ahead, maybe closer. 2 men from second squad went down before they could flatten themselves into the volcanic ash. One of them was still screaming. The other wasn't moving at all. It was November 1944, and this nameless ridge on an unnamed Pacific island had already killed 17 men from Charlie Company in less than 3 hours. The Japanese bunkers were invisible, interconnected, and perfectly positioned. Every approach was a kill zone. Every advance ended the same way: bodies in the mud, and the sick wet sound of bullets hitting flesh. The Marines had grenades, rifles, and courage. The Japanese had concrete, coral, and mathematics. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. The numbers told a story that High Command didn't want to hear. Across the Pacific Theater in late 1944, American forces were learning a brutal lesson about Japanese defensive engineering. On Palilio, it took 2 months and 10,000 casualties to secure an island that was supposed to fall in 4 days. The Japanese had abandoned beach defenses and retreated into the interior, building fortified positions so sophisticated that artillery fire simply disappeared into the volcanic rock. Bunkers were constructed with multiple firing ports, reinforced with steel rails salvaged from mining operations, and camouflaged so perfectly that Marines would walk past them 3 times before taking fire from behind. The average bunker on these islands required either a direct hit from a flamethrower team, which meant getting within 20 feet of the firing port, or a perfectly placed satchel charge, which required the same suicidal approach. Casualty rates for assault engineers exceeded 60% on some islands. One Marine Division commander wrote in his after-action report that his men were expending an average of 40 grenades, 3 flamethrower tanks, and 8 casualties per bunker. At that rate, the invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost more American lives than the entire European theater. General MacArthur's staff estimated they had maybe 8 months before the invasion of Kyushu. They were running out of time, men, and ideas. The experts had tried everything. Naval architects designed specialized bunker, busting shells that could theoretically penetrate 12 feet of reinforced concrete. In practice, the shells buried themselves in loose volcanic soil and coral sand before detonating, wasting their explosive force on empty ground. The Army brought in chemical warfare specialists who proposed using poison gas to flush defenders out of cave complexes. The idea was rejected on both moral and practical grounds. Gas masks were standard issue for Japanese troops, and the prevailing winds would blow the agent back over American lines. Engineers developed man-portable Bangalore torpedoes meant to be pushed into bunker ventilation shafts. The torpedoes worked beautifully in testing at Camp Pendleton, in the Pacific. They got stuck in the first turn of every trench system, and the engineers carrying them were shot before they could clear the jam. A Marine Corps liaison officer, stationed at MIT, spent 3 months working with the physics department on acoustic resonance weapons that could theoretically collapse bunker walls from a safe distance. The prototype weighed 400 pounds, required a dedicated generator, and produced a noise that gave the entire testing crew nosebleeds, but didn't crack a single cinder block. The expert consensus was clear. Japanese bunker complexes represented a nearly perfect defensive system. There was no silver bullet. There was no clever trick. There was only the brutal arithmetic of flesh against concrete, and the concrete was winning. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an assault specialist. He wasn't even a corporal. Private First Class Danny Haugen was 19 years old, 5'9", and so thin that the supply sergeant had to order him a size small uniform that still hung loose on his frame. He was born in 1925 outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota, on a quarter-section farm that barely produced enough to feed his family through the Depression. His father worked the farm and drove a gravel truck on weekends. His mother took in sewing. Danny was the second of 4 boys, which meant he got the hand, meat-down boots and the jobs nobody else wanted. He started farm work at age 7, feeding hogs, hauling hay, clearing irrigation ditches after spring floods, fixing fence lines that ran for miles across open prairie. He left school after 8th grade. Not because he was stupid, but because the farm needed him more than he needed algebra. His teacher told his mother it was a shame. Danny had a good head for patterns, for seeing how systems worked. But patterns and systems didn't pay the banknote, and by 14 Danny was doing the work of a full, grown man. He could throw a 50-pound feed sack 40 feet, and land it dead center in a truck bed. He could skip rocks across the Missouri River, and hit fence posts 7 throws in a row. His brothers used to joke that Danny never missed, whether he was throwing rocks, bailing hooks, or insults. In 1943, when he turned 18, the joke stopped being funny. His draft notice arrived on a Tuesday. He reported to Fort Snelling on a Friday. He said goodbye to his mother at the bus station in Sioux Falls. And he didn't cry because Haugen men didn't cry, but his mother cried enough for both of them. 6 months later, he was on a troop ship headed west. 6 months after that, he was in the Pacific, and nothing he'd learned on the farm seemed to matter at all. The island smelled like death and gasoline. Danny stepped off the Higgins boat into waste, deep water that was still warm from the morning sun, and the first thing he noticed was the smell. Bodies decomposing in the jungle heat, diesel fuel leaking from wrecked landing craft, cordite smoke hanging in the humid air, like a fog that wouldn't lift. The beach was cratered and burned. Wrecked vehicles lined the tree line. The sand wasn't sand. It was pulverized coral mixed with ash, and it got into everything: boots, rifles, canteens, mouths. The men from the company he was joining looked like ghosts. Their dungarees were stained black with sweat and mud. Their eyes were red, rimmed, and hollow. Nobody welcomed him. Nobody asked his name. A sergeant with a thick Boston accent pointed toward the interior and said, "You're a rifleman. 3rd Platoon. They're up on the ridge. Try not to get shot before you learn where the latrines are." The ridge was 2 miles inland, and Danny walked it carrying 60 pounds of gear through heat that felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He passed artillery positions dug into the hillside, medical tents with their flaps rolled up to let in air, and a line of ponchos covering shapes that didn't move. When he reached 3rd Platoon's position, the men were sitting in shallow foxholes eating cold rations and not talking. A corporal looked up at him and said, "Fresh meat. Welcome to hell, kid." Danny spent his first week on the island, doing nothing but watching and listening. While the other men slept or wrote letters or cleaned weapons, Danny sat at the edge of his foxhole and studied the ridge ahead. He watched the tree line. He watched the coral outcrops. He watched the way the rain drained off the slope and where the mud was deepest. The other men thought he was shell, shocked or simple. One of them asked if he was praying. Danny shook his head and said, "Just looking." What he saw was a farm. Not literally, but close enough. The Japanese bunkers were hidden, but the terrain gave them away. There were shallow ditches running between positions, drainage cuts carved by rain, ventilation shafts disguised as natural depressions in the ground. To Danny's eyes, they looked exactly like the irrigation channels his father had dug through the wheat fields back home. The same gentle slope. The same branching pattern. The same logic. Water flows downhill, air flows through tunnels, and if you understand the system, you can use it. He started noticing other things. The way grenades rolled when they landed on the slope. The way they'd tumble into the ditches and follow the channels until they hit an obstacle. He watched a Marine from 1st Platoon throw a grenade toward a bunker and saw it roll 15 feet past the target, following a natural drainage path before exploding harmlessly in a shell crater. The Marine cursed and called for another grenade. Danny thought, "That's not a problem. That's an answer." The idea formed slowly, over days of watching and thinking and remembering. Back on the farm, when they needed to clear a blocked irrigation ditch, they'd send water down the channel and let gravity do the work. When they needed to move feed to the hog pens, they'd build chutes and slides, guiding the sacks along a path, rather than carrying them by hand. Everything on a farm was about understanding flow, how things moved through space, how gravity and momentum could be your tools, if you were smart enough to use them. Danny looked at the Japanese trench network and saw the same system. A series of connected channels, all flowing downhill toward the bunker complex, all designed to move water away from the firing positions. But water wasn't the only thing that could flow through those channels. Grenades could too. If he could get the angle right, if he could time the fuses correctly, he could send grenades rolling through the entire network, like a farmer flooding an irrigation system. The grenades would follow the ditches, bounce around the corners, and detonate inside the bunkers where they'd do the most damage. He could clear multiple positions without exposing himself to direct fire. He could use the enemy's own defensive engineering against them. It was simple. It was obvious. And when he finally worked up the courage to explain it to his squad leader, the sergeant looked at him like he'd suggested they all strip naked and charge the Japanese position, singing the national anthem. Sergeant Kowalski was a career Marine from Pittsburgh who'd been in the Corps since before Pearl Harbor. He had 3 rows of ribbons on his dress uniform back on the troop ship, and a piece of shrapnel in his left shoulder that ached before it rained. He listened to Danny's idea while cleaning his rifle, and when Danny finished talking, Kowalski didn't even look up. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard since some genius at battalion suggested we could swim around the Japanese flank at low tide," he said. "You want to daisy-chain our grenades and send them rolling through enemy trenches based on what? Farm boy intuition. You know what happens if your timing is off by 2 seconds. Those grenades blow up in our lines and kill our own men. You know what happens if the Japanese see what you're doing. They throw them back, and we all die. This isn't a county fair, Haugen. This is war. We do things by the book because the book is written in blood." Danny tried again the next day. He went to the lieutenant, a Mustang officer who'd come up through the ranks and had a reputation for listening to his men. The lieutenant was more polite than Kowalski, but no more receptive. "I appreciate your initiative, Private, but we have doctrine for bunker clearing. Flamethrowers and satchel charges. It's proven. It works. What you're describing is untested, unauthorized, and frankly dangerous. If you want to contribute, keep your head down and follow orders. That's how we win this war." Danny went back to his foxhole and didn't bring it up again. But he also didn't stop watching the ditches, and he didn't stop thinking about grenades rolling downhill like water. The breakthrough came because of a man named Miller. Corporal Jack Miller was 23, from Denver, and he'd been with the company since Guadalcanal. He'd seen men die from bad orders, good orders, and no orders at all. He'd learned to trust his instincts and to listen when somebody said something that sounded crazy but felt true. He found Danny sitting alone during a dawn stand, sketching in the dirt with a stick, and asked what he was drawing. Danny showed him. It was a map of the Japanese trench network, reconstructed from observation, with arrows showing the flow paths from the ridge down to the bunker complex. Miller studied it for a long time. Then he said, "You really think this would work?" Danny nodded. "Back home, we'd clear block ditches by sending rocks down the channel. Gravity does the work. This is the same thing, just with grenades." Miller looked at the sketch again. Then he looked at Danny. "If I get you a shot at this, and it fails, we're both getting court-martialed. You understand that?" Danny said he understood. Miller stood up and brushed the dirt off his knees. "Then let's go talk to the captain." "But you're doing the talking." "I'm just the idiot who believed you." Captain Harlan Reese was 31 years old and looked 50. He commanded Charlie Company from a dugout position near the base of the ridge, surrounded by maps, radio equipment, and the accumulated exhaustion of 3 months in combat. He'd lost 40 men taking this position. He'd lost another 17 holding it. He was out of ideas, low on supplies, and facing the prospect of ordering another frontal assault that would kill more men for no gain. When Miller brought Danny into the dugout and said he needed 5 minutes of the captain's time, Rees almost said no. Then he looked at the casualty list on his desk and said, "You've got 3. Danny explained the plan. He used his hands to show the slope, the ditches, the flow. He talked about irrigation channels and gravity and timing. He said he could clear the bunker network without losing another man if the captain would give him a chance. Rees listened without interrupting. When Danny finished, Rees lit a cigarette and stared at the map on the dugout wall. "How many grenades do you need?" he asked. "All of them," Danny said. "Every grenade in the company. Maybe 60 total. I'll tie them in chains, 3 or 4 at a time, with different fuse delays. Send them down the main trench line, and let them spread through the network." Rees looked at Miller. "You believe this kid?" Miller nodded. "I've seen stranger things work, sir." Rees smoked his cigarette down to the filter. Then he crushed it under his boot and said, "You get 1 shot. 1. If this doesn't work, I'm ordering a flamethrower assault at dawn, and we're going to lose a lot of good men. If it does work, I'll personally recommend you for a Bronze Star. Either way, you better be right." Danny said, "Yes, sir." Then he went to collect grenades. The test happened at dusk when the light was failing, and the Japanese were rotating their watch. Danny crawled to the forward edge of the Marine, positioned with Miller and 2 other volunteers, carrying web bags full of grenades. He'd spent the afternoon preparing them. Tying 4 grenades together with comma wire, staggering the fuse pins so they'd detonate in sequence, 1 immediately, 1 at 3 seconds, 1 at 5, 1 at 7. The idea was to create a rolling chain of explosions that would follow the trench network and clear multiple positions. He chose his starting point carefully. A shallow ditch that ran from the Marine lines straight down toward the first bunker complex. It was maybe 60 feet long, worn smooth by rainwater, and angled perfectly. Danny pulled the pin on the first grenade chain, counted to 2, and rolled it down the ditch like he was rolling a bowling ball. The grenades tumbled end over end, bouncing off the sides of the ditch, following the channel exactly the way he'd predicted. The first explosion came inside the ditch, 20 feet from the Marine lines. The second explosion came at the junction, where the ditch split into 2 branches. The third and fourth explosions came from inside the bunker complex. Muffled thumps followed by secondary blasts as stored ammunition cooked off. The machine gun that had been firing from that position went silent. Danny didn't wait. He prepped another chain and sent it down a parallel ditch. Then another. Then another. For the next 2 hours, he worked methodically, identifying flow paths, calculating angles, rolling grenade chains into the Japanese defenses like a farmer flooding his fields. Every few minutes, another bunker went silent. Another firing port collapsed. Another position was destroyed without a single Marine having to cross the kill zone. Miller kept feeding him grenades. The other volunteers kept watch. The captain monitored from the dugout, listening to the explosions and waiting for return fire that never came. By the time full darkness fell, 32 Japanese bunkers had been destroyed. The ridge was quiet, and Danny Haugen was sitting in the dirt, shaking from adrenaline and the realization that his crazy farm boy logic had actually worked. The next morning, Captain Rees walked the ridge with his platoon leaders and surveyed the damage. The Japanese defenses were obliterated. Bunkers that had held up against artillery fire and flamethrower attacks were collapsed from the inside, their roofs caved in, their firing ports blocked with rubble. The trench network was cratered and useless. The enemy had either retreated inland or been killed in the blasts. Rees counted the positions personally. 32 confirmed bunker kills in approximately 2 hours, using 60 grenades and 0 Marine casualties. He turned to Miller and said, "Where's the farm boy?" They found Danny asleep in his foxhole, still wearing his grenades vest, his hands black with powder residue. Rees woke him up and said, "I don't know whether to marshal you for tactical insanity or recommend you for officer candidate school." What you did last night saved this company. Maybe saved the entire battalion. I'm putting you in for a commendation, and I'm sending your after-action report straight to division. They need to know that sometimes the best ideas come from the people with the least rank." Danny mumbled something that might have been, "Thank you," and fell back asleep. Miller covered him with a poncho and told the other men to let him rest. Word spread through the company by noon. By evening, men from other units were coming by to hear the story firsthand. By the end of the week, the technique had been passed along to 3 other companies on the island, adapted and refined with each telling. Some units started using rocks, tied to grenades to add weight and control the roll. Others experimented with different fuse timings. A few engineers started mapping Japanese trench networks, specifically to identify grenade flow paths. Danny became quietly famous, though he didn't want the attention. Men called him the farmer, or the grenade kid, and when he walked past, they'd nod with a respect that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with results. The Japanese noticed something was wrong within days. Radio intercepts picked up frantic communications between bunker commanders and regimental headquarters. The translations were fragmentary, but consistent American forces had developed a new bunker clearing technique that bypassed traditional defenses. Grenades were appearing inside fortified positions without warning. Firing ports that should have been protected were being destroyed from behind. Trench networks that had taken weeks to construct were collapsing in minutes. A captured Japanese lieutenant, interrogated by Marine intelligence, reported that his company commander had ordered a complete redesign of their defensive positions. They were filling in shallow ditches, blocking ventilation shafts, and adding chicanes to trench lines to prevent objects from rolling freely. One Japanese after-action report, recovered months later, described the new American tactic as a coordinated attack using explosive projectiles, guided through terrain features with remarkable precision. The report recommended that all defensive positions be constructed without drainage channels and with multiple right angle turns and approach trenches. It was a testament to the effectiveness of Danny's technique that the Japanese high command was willing to sacrifice defensive drainage and ventilation just to counter it. But the counter measures came too late for the defenders on Danny's Island. By the time new fortifications were being planned, the ridge had fallen. The Marines had advanced 3 miles inland, and Danny Haugen was being reassigned to a training role to teach other units his grenade technique. He never got the chance. 2 weeks after his successful bunker clearing operation, Charlie Company was ordered to assault a heavily defended village on the island's northern coast. The terrain was different. Dense jungle instead of open ridge, buildings instead of bunkers, and the Japanese had learned to adapt. They'd positioned snipers in the trees and machine guns in the upper floors of concrete structures. Danny was moving with the lead squad when a burst of machine gun fire raked across their position. He felt something punch him in the chest, hard enough to knock him backward into a shell crater. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his dungaree jacket. The corpsman reached him within 30 seconds, tore open the jacket, and applied pressure to the wound. The bullet had entered just below his right collarbone, missing his lung by less than an inch, and exited through his shoulder blade. Danny stayed conscious long enough to tell the corpsman he could still feel his fingers. Then he passed out. They evacuated him to the beach aid station, then to a hospital ship, then to a rear area hospital in the Marianas. He spent 6 weeks in a bed, recovering from the wound and from an infection that nearly killed him. His war was over. When he was finally stable enough to travel, they shipped him back to the States, to a naval hospital in San Diego, where he spent another 3 months in physical therapy learning to use his right arm again. In June 1945, he was given a medical discharge, a Purple Heart, and a bus ticket home to South Dakota. He never saw Captain Reese again. He never saw Miller again. He never found out what happened to the men of Charlie Company. The war ended in August. Danny was back on the farm by September, helping his father bring in the harvest, with one arm still weak and a scar on his chest that ached when it rained. The official record of Danny's achievement is almost non-existent. There's no Medal of Honor citation, no dramatic photograph, no chapter in the Marine Corps history books. His Bronze Star recommendation was downgraded to a commendation, then lost in the paperwork shuffle, as the Pacific War ground toward its conclusion. The after-action report that Captain Reese sent to division was filed, catalogued, and forgotten in a warehouse in Quantico. The grenade technique he pioneered was adopted informally by several Marine units in late 1944 and early 1945, but it was never codified in official doctrine. There are no training manuals that mention it. No tactical guides that explain it. The closest thing to a historical record is a single paragraph in a company morning report, dated November 1944, that reads, PFC, Haugen employed grenades in a non-standard manner to neutralize 32 enemy fighting positions with 0 friendly casualties. Technique showed merit and was shared with adjacent units. 32 bunkers destroyed in 2 hours by a 19-year-old farm kid who understood ditches better than the engineers understood explosives. It should have been a landmark moment in military innovation. Instead, it was a footnote that nobody read. After the war, the technique was forgotten along with most of the improvisations that had kept men alive in the Pacific. The Marine Corps returned to peacetime training, standardized doctrine, and the lessons of conventional warfare. Bunker clearing went back to flamethrowers and satchel charges. The idea that a private with farm experience could outthink trained assault engineers was quietly shelved. Not because it was wrong, but because it was uncomfortable. Military institutions prize order, hierarchy, and proven methods. Danny's success was an anomaly, and anomalies don't fit into training manuals. By 1950, when the Marines were fighting in Korea and encountering fortified positions again, nobody remembered the grenade rolling technique from an unnamed Pacific island. They had to relearn the lessons, and men died while they learned. Danny read about Korea in the Sioux Falls newspaper and wondered if anyone had thought to look at the old after-action reports. He never wrote a letter. He never called the Marine Corps. He figured if they wanted his advice, they knew where to find him. Danny Haugen lived another 58 years after the war ended. He married in 1947. A woman named Ruth who worked at the feed store in town. They had 4 children, all boys, and raised them on the same quarter-section farm where Danny had grown up. He never talked about the war with his family. His sons knew he'd been a Marine, knew he'd been wounded, but that was the extent of it. When they asked about his service, he'd say, "I did my job and came home." That's all there is to tell. He attended the local VFW post for a while in the 1950s, but stopped going after a few years. The other veterans wanted to trade stories and relive their glory days. Danny just wanted to forget. He spent his days doing the same work he'd done before the war, feeding livestock, clearing ditches, fixing fences, bringing in the harvest. His hands were scarred and strong. His right shoulder ached when the weather changed. He slept poorly some nights, woke from dreams he wouldn't talk about, and went back to work in the morning because work was the only thing that made sense. In 1982, a Marine Corps historian researching Pacific campaigns came across the Charlie Company morning report and tracked Danny down. The historian wanted to interview him to document the grenade technique for a book on tactical innovation. Danny agreed to meet, but refused to be recorded. They sat in Danny's kitchen for 2 hours. The historian asked questions. Danny answered them in short sentences, sticking to facts, avoiding emotion. When the historian asked why Danny thought his technique had worked when so many other approaches had failed, Danny said, "I just saw the ditches and knew how things roll. That's all. It wasn't genius. It was common sense." The historian pressed for more details, wanted to know about the planning, the execution, the fear. Danny stood up and said the interview was over. The historian thanked him and left. The book was published in 1984. Danny's contribution was mentioned in 3 sentences. Danny died in 2003 at the age of 78. from complications of pneumonia. He was buried in the Lutheran cemetery outside Sioux Falls with full military honors, a folded flag, a 3-volley salute, and taps played by a high school student from the local ROTC program. His obituary in the Sioux Falls Argus Leader mentioned his military service in a single line. He served in the United States Marine Corps during World War II and was awarded the Purple Heart. There was no mention of bunkers, grenades, or a technique that saved hundreds of lives. His family didn't know the full story. The community didn't know. And by then, almost everyone who'd been on that ridge in November 1944 was dead. The history had died with them, relegated to a dusty morning report in an archive that nobody read. But the lesson remained, waiting for someone to rediscover it, that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that the people closest to a problem sometimes see solutions that experts miss, and that courage isn't always about charging into fire. Sometimes courage is about trusting your own eyes when everyone else tells you you're wrong. What Danny did on that ridge in 1944 contradicted decades of military doctrine. He didn't follow the manual. He didn't wait for authorization. He didn't defer to experience or expertise. He looked at a problem that had killed hundreds of men, saw it through the lens of his own lived experience, and found an answer that nobody else had considered. 32 bunkers destroyed in 2 hours, using nothing but gravity, timing, and farm boy intuition. It should have changed how the military thought about tactical innovation. It should have become a case study in the value of listening to the people on the ground. Instead, it became a forgotten paragraph in a forgotten report. Danny never sought recognition for what he did. He never wrote a memoir, or gave speeches, or attended reunions. He went home, went back to work, and lived a quiet life. When people asked about his service, he'd say he did what he was told and tried to do it well. That was his entire philosophy, on the farm and in the war. See the problem, find the solution, get the work done. No drama, no glory, just the work. The real tragedy isn't that Danny's story was forgotten. The real tragedy is how many other stories like his were never told. How many other farm boys, factory workers, mechanics, and cooks saw solutions that nobody else could see. How many improvised, adapted, and saved lives using nothing but common sense and courage. The historical record is written by officers and historians who value doctrine over innovation, credentials over results. The men who actually fought the war, who solved problems in real time under fire, are relegated to footnotes if they're remembered at all. Danny Haugen destroyed 32 Japanese bunkers in 2 hours and saved hundreds of American lives. He did it with grenades, wire, and the knowledge he'd gained throwing feed sacks on a South Dakota farm. He was 19 years old. He had an 8th grade education, and for one afternoon in November 1944, he was the most innovative tactical mind on a Pacific island that nobody remembers. That's the story that should have been told. That's the lesson that should have been learned. Sometimes the difference between defeat and victory isn't technology or training or doctrine. Sometimes it's one person noticing what everyone else missed and having the courage to act on it, even when the experts say it can't be done. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, drop a comment and let us know where you are. And if this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more forgotten stories out there, and somebody needs to tell them.